word canon means standard. When the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, and its 24 books were translated in the year approximately 270 before the Christian era, in the days of Ptolemy Philadelphus. I think I've explained this to you before, when the Greeks were trying to, having now conquered and were dominating Egypt, in Alexandria, a city which they had named after Alexander in Egypt on the Nile. They were now collecting up all these books they could to get this knowledge, for they had burnt up so many. They were now trying to collect some back. They called in, according to the tradition, 70 Hebrew scholars. They put them in 70 different booths, and they had 2 supervisors of those scholars. And in 70 days, they had translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And therefore, it came to be known as the Septuagint Bible, spelled S-E-P-T-U-G-I-N-T. The Septuagint Bible, meaning version of the 70. And when we look for the abbreviation of that, it's LXX, 70 in Roman numerals. Version of the 70, the Septuagint. Now, this Septuagint now took the books from 24 and made them into 39, completely disrupted the order of the Hebrew, and added some books. 14 books, which came to be known as the Apocrypha, or hidden books, or later spurious books, or books we cannot be sure of whether they were inspired or not, because some of them were not originally written in Hebrew. The Israelites in Alexandria accepted them as being a part of the canon. But the Palestinian Hebrews did not accept them, because they did not originate, first of all, in Palestine, and secondly, because many of them were not originally written in Hebrew. So at the Council of Jamnia in AD 90, they decided once and for all to fix the canon of the Scripture. The College of the Rabbis gathered together, and they said this: we are not going to use the Apocrypha. We're not going to use those 14 books. They are not divinely inspired because they were written after the time of the days of Ezra. But remember now, Daniel and other books, as we have studied, was written after the days of Ezra too. They were written after the time of Ezra. Ezra's time was around 1444 before the Christian era. I don't remember now how long he lived. So in AD 90, they're saying everything that was written after 1444, before the Christian era, after the days of Ezra, we're not going to accept as Scripture. And it was not, they say at that time divine inspiration was cut off. The Creator stopped talking to men and having them write for him. They decided that was the date. How they came about that, I don't know. Mainly because they could not find any existing Hebrew copies of most of the text of the Septuagint. They could only find Greek ones. They would not accept it into the canon. Now, even though Daniel, Esther, and other books were written after that time, they could find original copies in Hebrew. And they accepted them and fixed the Hebrew Bible from then on. The Septuagint, or version of the 70, is the book from which Jesus quoted. It was the one most known at the time, and accepted by the early Christians or Nazarenes as their Bible, with the Apocrypha included. It was adopted by the Roman Catholic Church, but rejected by the Protestants, and a controversy lasted over that issue from 238 of the Christian era up to 1827 of the Christian era, when the Protestants in the person of the British and Foreign Bible Society excluded them all from all editions of the Bible, except for those in the pulpit, and that was supposed to settle it once and for all. What are these books they were fighting over so hard? Document 52. The first book of Ezra, which is Greek for Ezra. The second book of Ezra. The book of Tobit. The book of Judith. The additions to the book of Esther. The wisdom of Solomon. Ecclesiastes, or the wisdom of Sirach. The book of Baruch. The story of Susanna. The song of the three children. The story of Bel and the dragon. The prayer of Manasseh. The first book of Maccabees, and the second book of Maccabees. Now these books have some interesting stories and backgrounds in them. Some very good insights on Hebrew history that will give you some understanding of a lot of the things that Jesus was saying and doing. I don't think we're going to get time to go in them tonight. We'll have to pick up on them later because I had some of the stories from them I wanted to share. But what I want to do, I might be able to get into a little bit of it before I close. In closing out this section, let me talk about this period that these books developed in for a minute. The Hebrews were taken into captivity, and their nation was destroyed, and their capital, Jerusalem, was destroyed in 986 before the Christian era by the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar. They were divided into two separate kingdoms in one nation, and the first part of that kingdom, Israel, had been taken captive in 721 before the Christian era by the Assyrians. But the kingdom of Judah lasted until 586 when the Babylonians took it. When the Babylonians first came in and took a group of Hebrews in captivity, they left was a Jehoiakim in charge as a puppet king to reign as a vessel for the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. Jehoiakim rebelled. They came back, they took Jehoiakim, put his eyes out, took him in chains to Babylon, burned down the city, which destroyed the capital of the people. And they were kept in captivity for 70 years. 70 years. During the period of that 70 years is when they began to really formulate their doctrines and concepts and ideology, and began to try to put some of their books and literature together, because they really felt the need to do it now, being cut off from the center of their culture and the center of their nation. When you destroy the capital, man, that's something. They said they were asked to sing, but they could not sing the Lord's song in a strange land. When you don't have land of your own, you cannot sing a joyful song. When you're cut off from your liberation. I don't know what these niggas are singing about today. I'm not saying you're supposed to walk around morbid, but we just singing and dancing to people. For folks who don't have nothing they can call their own. And while in Babylon, they began to formulate what they had learned in Egypt, what they were learning from the Babylonians, which was an extension of one time of the Egyptian Empire. And during that course of that 70 years, the Persians took power from the Babylonians in that area. I'm trying to think of when the year was now that they took power from the Babylonians. Was it 532? I believe it was, but don't quote me on that date. I'll have to go back and look it up for sure. They come into power. The Hebrews are still subjected to them, but it is under the Persian kings now they are allowed to begin to return to their land. And it is Ezra that goes with the first group, or is it Nehemiah that goes with the first group to return to their land and to rebuild the temple and then the walls of Jerusalem and to start to rebuild their capital and reestablish themselves as a nation. It was a very difficult period. A very difficult period. They had to fight every step of the way. Folks came along to disturb them and shouted to Nehemiah, "Come down off the walls!" And Nehemiah said, "I'm doing too great a work. I cannot come down." And they had the workmen work with a sword by their side as they worked. Like Charles Coyne in Cairo, Illinois, had a Bible in this hand for direction and a weapon in this hand for protection. That's how they had to work and struggle. Nehemiah now gathers together all of the books that they can find that is presently existing and forms them into a body of Hebrew literature, which becomes their scripture. It's a great work that he does, a strenuous work. After Nehemiah and Ezra leave the scene, the Persians are in turn conquered by the Greeks. And the Greeks overpower. When they come down into Palestine and into Egypt, they now put the Hebrews under subjugation and try to make them live according to the Greek lifestyle, which you know was repugnant to them. They even went so far as to set up gyms around the city of Jerusalem itself. And the Greeks ran naked in their gyms because they were involved and they didn't have mind that kind of close relationship between men. They fought naked in their early days. They had a cape, a shield, and a helmet. And the rest of them, you can see that in the pictures on their blouses and so forth. Because it came all the way from the Scythian custom. When they defeated a contestant in battle, they homosexually violated him. That was one day. It was a degenerate culture. Now, this was a shock to the Hebrews, indeed. They also now, as the Greek Empire began to decline, this is at this period that the Apocrypha and all that was being written. This is what was going on in the world, in the Hebrew world, related to the Hebrew world, and to Egypt, because Egypt was being overrun and dominated by these people. When the Greek Empire of Alexander falls apart, it splits into four pieces, and the ones who inherit the portion which belongs, that you find the Hebrews in, the Israelite state in, the little kingdom of Judea, are the Syrians. And the worst Syrian to come up during that period is Antiochus Epiphanes. This man loves to torture people. And he puts out a law that the only person that is to be worshipped in the land is him. And they go into the Jewish temple or the Hebrew temple and serve pork on the altar and force the Hebrews to eat it. One woman, and you find this in the books of First or in Second Maccabees, named after Judas Maccabeus, the word Maccabees meaning the hammer. We're going to go into these books in detail later. I'm just giving you some background here. Because when Jesus comes on the scene, he starts talking about things that you'd never heard about in the Old Testament. The synagogue, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. These things are not even mentioned in the Old Testament. They didn't come up until this period between the Testaments, while the Hebrews were in subjugation to these people. There are a woman and her 7 sons, and they tell them, if you don't eat this pork, we're going to torture you and kill you. And they said, no matter what you do, we're not going to violate the traditions of our ancestors, our elders. We will not accept your way of life. This thing of not eating pork goes all the way back to ancient Egypt, by the way. Plus they knew what was in, they had looked under that thing under the microscope, they knew what was in that pork. We're supposed to eat it. He takes her son and says, her first son, and said, if you don't eat this piece of pork, this is what's going to happen to you. He takes a big, oversized frying pan, which he has made for this occasion, which holds a human body, puts hot oil in it, and heats it up. He snatches out the boy's tongue, cuts it out, He says, will you eat this pork? He shakes his head and keeps his mouth closed. You know, they did that to the slave on the slave ship. In the middle passage, he wouldn't eat. They'd break his teeth, take funnel and put the food down in his mouth and make him eat. He would not eat. Many of them, it was a part of his protest. They cut off his limbs one from the other, and finally they take his torso and cast it into the fire and let it burn, and you can smell the stench everywhere. And they say to the others, are you going to eat this pork? They say no. And they keep doing it. But they say as each one of them went down, they told him, say, you may be in power now, but there's a God in heaven who rules in the affairs of men, and you cannot make me turn on the ways of my Father. You may say, why did they go through all that about a piece of pork? Couldn't they have eaten a piece of pork? Because they asked one of the elders, they said, it was Eleazar, they said, why don't you eat, you can eat a piece of beef and pretend it's pork. He said, no, because then the youth will be corrupted and think that I have given in to you. The eating of the pork was a political statement. That is why they would not eat it. To transgress the laws of Moses and of their ancestors in the Torah was a political statement. It was almost the same as saying, will you tell me where those revolutionaries went and where they hid and snitching? And they killed all 7 of the boys and the mother. And when it was heard about, Judas Maccabees, the hammer, comes on the scene. It's between 175 and 164. And this black man kicked an awful lot of Eurasians behind and established independence for the Israelites, for the Hebrews, for almost 100 years. This Judas Maccabeus had come from an ancestor called Hasmon, and Judas Maccabeus was the founder of the Hasmonean dynasty. After Judas came his brother John, and after John came Simon. No, this is way before Simon. No, this is before Simon the Just. I think it is Simon the Just. I'm sorry, sister, because he was a very devout man. Yes, he was. I think he's called Simon the Just. I'm thinking of James the Just now. Simon the Just. He comes out of this a line of leaders, claimants, kings to the throne of Israel, and it is out of this line that Jesus is born of the Hasmonean dynasty. So when you hear me talking about that on my tapes, he comes from this bloodline of warriors who were constantly fighting to do what? Restore the kingdom to Israel. In our day, to free the land. That is what the whole struggle is about. When you read the Bible from Genesis on through to Revelation, it's a struggle of a people to establish themselves on their own land and to maintain independence on that land, which they did for a time until they transgressed their culture and fell into the ways of the enemy nations around them, the Eurasians and finally the Europeans. This is what Jesus had in mind when he appeared on the scene. He did not come to die for the sins of the world. No way. And I've always said this. I'm not attacking anyone's belief. If Jesus died for the sins of the world and to redeem the world, he utterly failed if that was his purpose. Because the world is 1,000 times worse today than it was in his day. And black people have suffered the worst form of slavery they ever knew. And they had gone through some changes they have ever known. And the world is in worse shape than it has ever been. But they keep telling me, well, if everyone would accept Jesus Christ and the gospel, the change would come. But the Americans say they have accepted it. Every church in this country say they have accepted it. There are Europeans all around the world that say they have accepted it. And this gospel shall be preached into all the world, and then shall the end come. Everybody has heard about Jesus around the world. And the end has not come. There is not any place I don't know of that they have not heard about it. even in the jungles of the Amazon River. The white man has taken that there. So don't tell me the reason why Jesus hasn't come again and out of the sky and the world has not been transformed is because all the world has not received the gospel. They have so. Everyone has heard about the gospel, as you say, but the word gospel means good news. And for a people who is being subjugated by another people, there's only one kind of good news. Freedom, liberation. There is no other good news. There is no other. This is what Jesus was all about. So when we look in the book of Genesis, we find that before God makes man, he first creates some what? Land. To put him on that land. And when he acts up and shows his behind, according to the scripture, and we're going into the story of Adam and Eve and the snake and all that, tell you what all that symbolism means. He throws him off the land. And he has to go out and struggle from then on to build him some new land. He can't even go back in the garden anymore. It was all set up for him, but he blew it, so the story goes. So there they put him off the land. In the days of Noah, in the time of the flood, as the story goes, Noah spent, after the 40 days, 40 again, of rain, he spends 150 days floating on water, waiting until he sees some. And when the dove comes with the twig in his mouth, he knows he has found some dry land. That's what he's interested in. When he emerges from the ark, he settles on some dry land. When at the Tower of Babel, they decide to build this great tower that reaches up into the clouds as a monument to their kingdom and empire. During the days of Nimrod, according to the Bible, it was to celebrate their dominance and control over some. When Abraham leaves Ur of Chaldea, going to Egypt to get permission to settle in the promise, when Jacob comes up with his 12 sons and settle on the land where Abraham lived, and they now go down in Egypt to keep from starving, and they stay down there, and 430 years later, the Hebrews, Israelites, come out under Moses. They cross the Red Sea in search of the promised land. After the death of Moses, when Joshua fights the battle of Jericho, he is fighting to liberate some. All those years that they spent under the judges for 200 years, under Samson, Ehud, Deborah, Barak, and all the rest of them, I can't think, Jephthah, all the judges of the land before they had a king. Their object in their conflict and battle with the surrounding nations was to maintain some land. When David comes on the scene, or when Saul becomes the first king of Israel, and David becomes the second king of Israel and fight with the Philistines to maintain independence, he is fighting to hold land. When all the kings of Israel, through all of the 20 of Judah and the 19 of Israel, are fighting and living to administrate a government so that they could keep control over some land. When they're taken in captivity by the Babylonians, and for 70 years they're down in Babylon and they're under the captivity of the Persians, and when they finally allow them to let them go and they return to Jerusalem, they are going back to some land of their own. When Judas Maccabees rose up to fight against Antiochus Epiphanes and the other oppressors, he was fighting to defend. Amen. So now when Jesus enters on the scene, after such a glorious tradition, of struggling for land all the way from the creation until his day, what do you think he was interested in? The kingdom of God is at hand. And a kingdom is a government. And you have government over a people who inhabit territory which is called a... Brothers and sisters, in the book of Revelations, and I'm closing now, it says, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth was passed away, and there was no more sea. I don't have time to explain what the no more sea was. It's symbolic. But what John was seeing, he said, I saw the city, the new Jerusalem, descend out of God from heaven, and it rested on some land. From Genesis to Revelations, the whole book is about a people going in search of a land of their own so that they can have a government of their own. This is what the Bible is all about. In the process of doing that, they had to apply the most ancient spiritual principles which came all the way from Cush through Kemet, up through Phoenicia, all over into Babylonia, Assyria, and other places. These spiritual principles which gives you the power to maintain and control some land. For the first thing to arise out of the primal waters was land. In the person of Ptah, which represented the land. That's what it's all about, brothers and sisters, when you read the Bible. Peace be with you.
Attention listeners. In keeping with the Fourth Dynasty Publishing Company philosophy that 1. The scholarly language and materials of the academician should become the property of black people from all walks of life, and 2. That the repetition of certain key factors will help us to internalize this life-giving, mind-expanding information so that it may in turn become an integral part of our total nature. That is to say, the reflection we see of ourselves in the mirror on a daily basis. It therefore seemed fitting that the subject matter contained in the first part of this album should be reiterated so as to stabilize the Afrocentric concepts which are generally not of common knowledge to the masses. Thus, we are completing Volume 1 with a rendition of the African origin of the Bible as it was presented a few months later to a study group in Wilmington, Delaware. We believe you will find the varied dimensions of this offering to be a very useful means of reaffirming and expanding upon the basic premise that the Bible originated in the land of the blacks.
Brothers and sisters, we're going to begin now with document 1. Lesson is the African origin of the Bible. And we're calling upon an outstanding scholar, a pioneer in the field, Mr. Joel A. Rogers, Professor Joel A. Rogers, from his book, 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro. And he states thusly, the Bible really originated. It did what? And we have to talk to each other in here. I'm used to talking, sharing with you. Originated. That means, what's another word for originated? Started, began in ancient Egypt, where the population, according to Herodotus and Aristotle, was black. Here, the Jews received almost all of their early culture. Professor Breasted, leading Egyptologist, says, the right social and moral development of mankind in the Nile Valley, which is 3,000 years older than that of the Hebrews, contributed essentially to the formation of Hebrew literature. Our moral heritage, therefore, derives from a wider human past, enormously older than the Hebrew, and has come to us rather through the Hebrews than from them. Now let's analyze this document. This one document is going to take us on a course, an adventure of study here. First off, he states that it originated in Egypt. On the continent of Africa, what he says essentially is that the Bible is where the Bible originated, where the Bible began. So when you look for the beginning of the Bible, it starts right there on the continent of Africa. He says that's where you start. And he says there were several white men who reaffirmed this, some of what they call the Greco-Latin scholars, and we're going to mention over 12, 14, 15 of them in the process of our study. These were Greeks and Romans who had a first-hand account because they were there in the flesh. They didn't have to wonder whether they were black people. There was no confusion about it. There was no way in those days that Europeans could say that Egyptians were dark-skinned Caucasians, because they were on the scene. Today they can say that because most people have never been to Egypt, have never seen the indigenous population there. So they can get away with it in many cases until here of late. But these men, Aristotle and Herodotus, saw firsthand. Who were these men? Herodotus, who wrote the books of histories and some others which we will be quoting from in our study, was one of those Greeks who had an attitude which transcended the general one of violence and fighting. He was a Greek who sought after knowledge, an inquiring Greek. And he began to travel around the world following the lead which had been given by Homer. He decided to travel the world and to gather knowledge. One of the first places he wanted to visit was Egypt and Ethiopia, as the Greeks called it. It is more properly called Kemet, K-E-M-A-T, and Ethiopia should be called Kush. Ethiopia is a Greek name, which we'll talk about a little later, and Egypt is a Greek designation. This is what the people called themselves, Kemet and Kush. And we will later go into why they called themselves Kemet. Well, he had to go there first because that is where the repository of knowledge was. There were no universities in the world except the universities which existed there. There were no great libraries in the world of over 500,000 books in existence but there. So that is the place he had to go to get his knowledge. And he said, when I traveled to this place, and we'll find out later on why they all went to Ethiopia too. He said, when I traveled to this place, the first thing I saw when I got in the land, when I first entered the land, was a big black man on a lion's body facing me when I came in. And all around me as I walked was large statues of black men and black women. And then the people whom I came in contact with were jet black people with thick, crisp hair. This is what Herodotus said he saw firsthand. So there was no question as to who the Egyptians were. They knew they were not Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner and Liz Taylor and all of them. They understood who they were. This man, one of the first to bring knowledge to the Greeks, was one of those who taught what came to be misnomered as Greek philosophers, which is another subject we'll be getting to. And in that trend of seekers from Greece came one known as Aristotle some years later. And Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander, misnomered the Great. Because, as you read in my book, African People and European Holidays, Mental Genocide, Book 2, I quote Dr. John G. Jackson when he says, when he's talking about the ancient civilization of Crete and how marvelous it was, the Minoan civilization it was called, and how marvelous a civilization it was. And we will be talking about it in the future in detail. He says that in the midst of all this greatness which was being developed, where they had hot and cold running water and flashing toilets, paved streets, terracotta bathrooms. He said they had pipes running in the street of which Europeans have never had until the 19th century. Like that. Copper pipe, copper tubes. He said in the midst of all this, there came a group of people
known as Greeks, and snatched the copper out the houses, like some of us do today, unfortunately, and tore up everything. He said these Greeks who came on the scene about 1400 before the Christian era and hit Crete with such devastation, one of the high African civilizations which had been established by Egypt and Ethiopia, the island of Crete. I'm glossing over it now, but I'll deal with it in detail, Crete, later. I'm talking about Egypt, believe it or not, but I had to talk about this to get back to it. He says they were the first civilized white folks. He said there were no civilized white people anywhere in the world, and no white scholars tried to contest him on that, because they all say in the Western world that their civilization began with the who? The Greeks. And when you go to their institutions of higher learning, you, if you want to make it in their world of academia and business, must become a member of one of their what? Greek-lettered organizations. That's it, so you become Greek-centric in your worldview, which is why we come out so sick, not understanding where we are. Because it causes a dichotomy in you. It causes schizophrenia as opposed to your nature. But that we will deal with in detail later as well. Now, they hit there in 1400 before the Christian era, but they do not become civilized. He says they're the first civilized white folks, but he doesn't say they become civilized right then. Because they do not begin to become civilized now until about 331. Putting it on the board, that means write it down. 331 before the Common Era, when Alexander, misnomer the Great, who was taught by Aristotle, and who encouraged him, Aristotle said, look, Alexander, there are wonders in this land, the which we could not imagine. These men are gods. Like Homer wrote in his writings, all the gods go to the sacred land of Ethiopia, because this is a sacred race. This is the pinnacle of civilization. This is where it all began. They even read books down there, man. So Alexander said, yes, I must go invade this place. And when they came to invade it, who did they have to fight? And how come Aristotle could say they were black people? Because he was engaged in a struggle with them. He knew who they were. Unfortunately, we lost that battle, and Alexander took over that portion of Egypt. He never did get down below the Sixth Cataract, because when he met with the Candaces of Ethiopia, of Kush, Candace was straddled on 2 elephants, and there was 100,000 Nubian warriors around her. And the word Nubia means land of the bow, because they had the biggest bow in the world. And the only people who could pull the bow were the Nubians, were the Africans, the Kushites. There was 100,000 of them blood surrounding this fine sister, straddling 2 elephants. And Alexander said, I am here to conquer the world. She said, come on. He decided he had done enough. He threw a spear at the Mediterranean Sea and said, I have no more worlds to conquer. Went home and drank himself to death. But that's another story behind it. His heart was broken behind a black woman had chumped him and took his manhood as far as he was concerned. And then, I'm sorry to say this, I hate that this even happened in history, but we have to tell the good with the bad. There was Cletus. I didn't intend to get all into this, but we haven't even gotten out the first sentence yet. Well, I hope you all don't mind this detail. If you do, let me know. Cletus was his lover, this black man. But see, that's the Greek society, man. That's part of the Greek society. And they will tell you that. Yeah. Cletus was Alexander, misnomer the Great's lover. But Cletus got tired of Alexander and wanted him a woman. The blood got tired of all that. He wanted to try to get back to his true self. And going with this woman angered Alexander so. And in one of their council sessions, there was an argument between Cletus and Alexander, which caused Alexander to become infuriated at his lover and kill him with a spear. After killing him, he was heartbroken and had no reason to live anymore. I just can't make it without you. he drank 6 Herculean cups. That was 12 quarts a cup. Over a matter of a few days, he drank 6 Herculean cups of alcohol, was seized with a fever, and died. You will find that in the book Daniel and the Revelations by Uriah Smith, which is published by Seventh-day Adventists. So, this man, Aristotle, shows you what kind of company he kept, comes in with Alexander, knows that he's faced with black people. So Herodotus and Aristotle tell us that these people in the land where the Bible originated and began were black people. There was no question about that. While Aristotle was there with Alexander, then began the thievery and the robbery of the repositories of African knowledge. I think I better go into a little of the detail on that now. This never would have happened to the African had they not permitted the Greeks to come study with them. When they first began to allow Herodotus and some of the others to study with them, they broke the rule which had been laid down by the priesthood for thousands of years. Because we can trace the Kemetan Empire back at least 18,000 years before the Christian era. And the fundamentalist Christian says that the world began 6,000 years ago. But we can trace the empire of Kemet. So Kemet was in existence before the world began if you follow the fundamentalist Christian outlook. Again, I'm not attacking anyone's belief. I want you to understand that. Just approaching it from a historical analysis. That's the longest empire that had ever existed on earth that we know of so far. There is no European empire that existed 18,000 years. In fact, I don't know any that has ever existed over 1,000 years or such. Rome was the longest running one they had. And I think it barely made it 1,000 years if it made it that long. Rome came on the scene as a strong military power in 168 before the Christian era. You want me to put it on the board? Once I put it on the board, it's yours. 168 before the Christian era is when Rome came on the scene as a world power. She went down in 476 of the Christian era. The city of Rome was founded in 715 before the Christian era, when a dog led them to the site, their mother, because they said that their mother was a dog. But that's another subject. I'll get into that later. But as an empire, it did not last 1,000 years. And that was the longest running one. Yours is the only empire that has existed for over 18,000 years before it went down. And it was set into motion by its mother, who is the oldest that we know of, and we haven't been able to find a starting date for, and that was the Kushai Empire, which they misnomer the Ethiopian Empire. Now, when they allowed the Greeks to come in to study with them in the year 525 before the Christian era, in the year 525 before the Christian era, when Ahmes I of Egypt, king of Egypt, allowed them to come in, that was the beginning of the downfall. They broke a cardinal rule. This was knowledge they were not even sharing with the common black man in the land. Now they're allowing a foreigner to come in and study. And it was only a matter of a few more years after that the Persians had been able to take control in Egypt, and then later the Greeks were to devastate it. And then by the time of Cleopatra, it was more Greek in where the pyramids existed around Memphis and Alexandria and all those cities. It was more Greek than it was African, and then Julius Caesar just wiped it out. And from that time to this, it has never been a world power, it's said, and today is controlled by foreigners in the person of Arabs and Eurasians. Your land and the land of the blacks that produced all of the sciences that we're going to be talking about. There wouldn't be a Bible or no kind of writing if it wasn't for these people here that come from that area. While Aristotle was there,